Dinuba Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to our online video Bible study series on the life and the writings of the Apostle Paul. We're continuing this series on the most prolific writer of the New Testament and a great figure of our faith who had an incredible impact on the development and the spread of Christianity all around the world. Thanks again to you all for engaging with this study and for your patience as I was getting back on track from having coronavirus, but we're ready to keep on rolling. So as much as we honor and appreciate the Apostle Paul, it's apparent from the scriptural record that he was not always the most interesting or dynamic or even self-aware speaker. In Acts chapter 20, Luke relates an episode from Paul's visit to the city of Troas, where he had been invited to preach a message on a Sunday. Not surprisingly, Paul lost all track of time as he started to preach, and he started preaching for hours and hours and hours from the third-story room of the house of a local believer. A young lad named Eutyches did his very best to stay awake as Paul was talking, but eventually this long-winded sermon put Eutyches to sleep, and he fell out of the window 3 stories to his death. Paul took a quick break, raised Eutyches from the dead, had a snack, and then got right back to preaching, and in fact did about 4 or 5 more hours of preaching until the sun rose the next day. This is the reason why we recommend you always watch these studies from a first-story room in whatever building you happen to be in. In contrast to his speaking style, the life and the writings of the Apostle Paul are nothing if not exciting. Shipwrecks, riots, daring escapes, and courtroom dramas. Paul's later life is marked by incredible events, which were kicked off by his experience on the Damascus Road. So last week, we began constructing a biography of Saul of Tarsus, also known as Paul, from his birth all the way up to the Damascus Road event, which happened sometime in either 33 or 34 AD. This is what Luke says about that event. Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, "Ananias." And he said, "Here I am, Lord." And the Lord said to him, "Rise, and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul. For behold, he is praying, and he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him, so that he might regain his sight." But Ananias answered, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem, and here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who call on your name." But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." So Ananias departed and entered the house, and laying his hands on him, he said, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and he regained his sight. Then he rose and was baptized, and taking food, he was strengthened. And Paul was going to need that strength and a whole lot more for everything that God had in store for him through the rest of his life. So let's continue piecing together a timeline in our biographical sketch of the Apostle Paul. From this point forward, we're guided in this endeavor by a remarkable piece of scholarship that's virtually unknown in the world of theological studies, but fortunately it is available to us. It's not studied in any seminary, and the number of people who have read it can be counted on just two hands. It's a work entitled simply Paul's Travels and Writings, and it's the result of years of careful study by a pastor and teacher who used to minister right here in the Central Valley named Harold Watkins. Mr. Watkins, now retired to Tennessee, but still very active in his studies and his activities, has a son named Nate Watkins, who's now a pastor in upstate New York. Years ago, when Nate lived and served in Southern California, he gave me my first job in professional ministry, and he's a mentor to me. And in fact, we named our son Nathaniel in his honor. Nate introduced me to his father Harold's work on this subject a few years ago, and I'm really excited to be leading heavily on this work as we go forward with our timeline. So, establishing dates for the events in Paul's life from this point onward really means establishing dates for the book of Acts itself. Luke doesn't provide us with specific dates to track the events that he writes about, and so some detective work is necessary. What Harold Watkins did, I think very intelligently, was identify historic events mentioned in Acts that can be corroborated from other historical sources that are very easy to date. Watkins found 5 such events, what he called 5 anchor points, that can serve as a skeleton timeline that we can start building around. We'll start with the first 2 of these 5 anchor points. That is, first, the birth of the church in 33 AD, and also Paul's escape from Damascus sometime between 37 AD and 40 AD. After Paul was rehabilitated by Ananias in Damascus, he went to the local synagogue to begin telling the Jews meeting there about his experience and to talk about his new faith in Jesus as the Messiah. They were completely shocked that Paul, the famous threat-breathing dragon of Jerusalem, had succumbed to this new belief, and the scandal of Judaism's fiercest opponent of the church becoming a follower of Jesus was just too much to bear. The synagogue leaders in Damascus hatched a plot to kill Paul, but the Christians help him escape to Jerusalem, lowering him over the walls of the city in a basket to conceal him. Paul mentions in 2 Corinthians 11 that this happened during the reign of King Aretas, who is known to history and whose reign over the nomadic Nabatean people was recorded by the first century historian Josephus. Aretas took over the city of Damascus in 37 AD, and he died in 40 AD, according to Josephus. So we know that Paul's escape from Damascus to Jerusalem must have happened sometime within that range. After climbing out of the basket, Paul went to Jerusalem, but his arrival terrified the church for very obvious reasons, as he pleaded with them to trust the sincerity of his new faith and his desire to be their brother in Christ. He found help from an old friend. Tradition holds that Paul and Barnabas of Cyprus were schoolmates in their youth in Tarsus. It's difficult to verify this, but given the position of Tarsus as a center of learning in the Roman Empire, and the fact that it's a relatively short sea voyage to go from Cyprus, where Barnabas is from, to Tarsus, it's really not outside the realm of possibility that they studied together and knew each other and had been friends before. If they did have a pre-existing relationship, this may help us understand why Barnabas was so quick to come to Paul's defense and advocate for him to the Jerusalem church. Though the Christians came to accept Paul and to admire him, the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem was enraged when he was discovered worshiping at the temple while speaking about Jesus. As Paul received a vision from God at the temple to carry the message of Jesus to the Gentiles, the Jewish religious leaders began a new effort to have Paul killed. The church helped Paul flee Jerusalem to the port city and Roman provincial capital of Caesarea, where he got on another boat and he sailed to his childhood home of Tarsus. This begins what scholars call Paul's silent years. We really don't know what Paul was up to during this time in his hometown. We don't have any extant letters that he wrote from this period, and even the narrative of the book of Acts kind of leaves Paul behind for a little bit, focusing once again on Peter before coming back to Paul in chapter 13. One theory suggests that some of the events that Paul recounts from his life in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 took place during this silent period. We cannot account for all of the shipwrecks that Paul says that he was in. Paul says he's been in 3, and we know that he experienced at least one more after he wrote 2 Corinthians, for a total of 4 shipwrecks during his lifetime. But this leaves us with one shipwreck with which we cannot account. And he also talks about instances in which he was punished with 39 lashes by synagogue authorities. It's possible that several of these instances of discipline and maybe one shipwreck happened during these silent years, but we really just don't know. The silent years end when Barnabas returns to Tarsus to find his old friend. Barnabas asks Paul to return with him to Antioch to help the churches there on the other side of the sea. Paul agrees, but while they're attending to those churches, a great famine begins in that area. Paul and Barnabas are sent to Judea with aid for the poor churches that are struggling to find food. This famine is an important clue to help us establish our next anchor point in history and continue applying dates to the events of the book of Acts. And it buddies up with another important clue concerning the death of Herod Agrippa, which Luke depicts in Acts chapter 12. We can turn back to our helpful friend, the historian Josephus, who notes that Herod Agrippa died in the 3rd year of the reign of Claudius, the Roman Emperor Claudius, which yields a date of 44 AD for Herod Agrippa's death. The next question we have to ask then is whether or not the famine Paul and Barnabas are responding to can be identified around that same time. Josephus does identify the famine as taking place during the reign of Cupius Fatus as procurator of Judea, who happened to start his time in office in 44 AD. So this all looks very much on track for us to say confidently that Paul and Barnabas arrived in Jerusalem with aid for the poor churches there in 44 AD. So we're making progress. We now have 3 of the 5 historical anchor points of the book of Acts identified. So let's keep moving and look for our 4th anchor point in that book and in the life of the Apostle Paul. The next major step for Paul in the story of his life are his missionary journeys, which most of us have seen outlined and helpfully mapped out for us in the back of our Bibles, usually in really nice special color pages. For the purposes of time, we're not going to go into detail as to how we have derived the following dates, but we know that Paul's first and second missionary journeys took place after the 3rd anchor point that we just identified with the death of Herod Agrippa and the famine in 44 AD. The first journey happened from 45 to 46 AD, and the second missionary journey of Paul took place from 48 AD to 52 AD. And that takes us right up to the 4th of our 5 anchor points, which is Paul's arrest in Corinth in 52 AD. This is recorded for us in Acts chapter 18. Paul arrives in Corinth, and as is his custom, he focuses his time and his energy, that is, on preaching and teaching in the synagogues, arguing from the Old Testament scriptures that Jesus is the Messiah. He has limited success. One ruler of a Corinthian synagogue and his family come to faith, but most are uninterested or offended, and eventually yet another plot is hatched to have Paul arrested. But this time, Sosthenes, a synagogue leader, tries a new tactic: have Paul taken before the local Roman authority, a man named Gallio, proconsul of Achaia. But much to the surprise of the synagogue leaders, Gallio is thoroughly unimpressed by the case that is brought before him against Paul. In his Roman mind, the matter is entirely an internal Jewish affair, amounting to nothing more than an argument over names and words in Jewish history. He dismisses the complaint outright and has the Jewish leaders forcibly removed from his court, all before Paul has said a single word. Outraged at his failure, Sosthenes' fellow synagogue leaders beat him in the street outside the Roman tribunal building. There's some speculation that the church community in Corinth reached out to Sosthenes after this event, and that he became a believer in Jesus, and that Paul may have had further contact with Sosthenes, because a man named Sosthenes is a co-signer of the first letter to the Corinthians. But how sure can we be that this event in Acts 18 that we just described took place in 52 AD? The answer is actually extremely sure. In this case, we have something even better than the histories of Josephus to confirm this date. We have actual archaeological evidence from this area of the world and from that time. In the late 19th century, several limestone fragments were discovered in the city of Delphi, which is in the same Roman province as the city of Corinth. Initially, they seemed to be unrelated to one another until researchers realized that they actually fit together, like puzzle pieces. And once arranged properly, they could begin reading the full message inscribed on what was once an intact limestone tablet. The message is really a political ad, very similar to the political ads that we see today on television and on social media and in other forms of media in our culture. But the message is from Emperor Claudius, and in it he mentions his good friend Gallio, and notes that Gallio was appointed as proconsul of the province of Achaia, quote, in the 12th year of my tribunician. Since we know that Claudius became emperor in 40 AD, all we have to do is do some quick arithmetic, and we arrive at 52 AD. Proconsuls only served 1-year terms, so we can be very confident of this date. After these events in Corinth, Paul begins his third and final recorded missionary journey, which occurred approximately from 53 AD to 57 AD. The end of this journey takes us to Acts chapter 21 and an ill-fated visit by Paul to the temple in Jerusalem. The Christian community in Jerusalem had thought that Paul's visit there might help dispel some of the rumors and worries that he was preaching a message of extreme antagonism to the Mosaic law. Paul was not preaching the uselessness of the law, but rather the obsolescence of the law in light of the resurrection of Jesus. But Paul never really got a chance to make this argument. He had become such a figure of division and so reviled by the temple authorities he had once served that his mere presence almost instantaneously starts a riot, and the Romans intervene in Jewish religious unrest once again. The Romans arrest Paul, but have little interest in prosecuting him given his status as a Roman citizen, and because he hasn't broken any identifiable Roman law. So in typical aloof imperial style, they remand Paul back to the custody of the Sanhedrin, the council of Jewish religious leaders in Jerusalem. The members of the council make a very dramatic vow, pledging to themselves and to each other that they will neither eat nor drink until Paul is dead. Paul's nephew discovers this plot by the Sanhedrin, and he makes the fateful decision to once again appeal to Rome for relief, asking the imperial tribune to make arrangements to have Paul escorted out of Jerusalem under Roman guard and transferred to the port city of Caesarea to be examined by Felix, the procurator of the Judean province. Felix heard Paul's case, but being a cagey kind of guy and not wanting to get involved in the conflict either, Felix decides to send Paul back to Jerusalem and defer deciding his case for over a year. This allows Paul to stay in Jerusalem in relative safety, but leaves him in imperial legal limbo until Felix is replaced by a new proconsul, Festus, in 59 AD. We can confirm this date both through the historian Josephus and through some Roman coins that were minted in the year 59 AD as well. We're not sure if Festus had a low opinion of Felix's abilities or if he was just exceedingly confident in his own judicial acumen, but apparently Festus saw Paul's case was still open on Felix's old desk, and he decided that he'd have a crack at it himself. And in just a few days after taking office, Festus traveled to Jerusalem to learn more about the case, and a few days later summoned both Paul and representatives from the Sanhedrin to Caesarea to hear the case once again. Festus quickly found himself drowning underneath this internal Jewish squabble without a clear imperial interest. And just like Felix the year before, he decides that he also wants nothing to do with this whole affair, this whole can of worms that he's reopened. But Paul is tired of his missionary work being disrupted by endless Roman legal wrangling. His mandate to spread the gospel to the Gentiles cannot be accomplished if he's trapped in Jerusalem, awaiting a Roman judicial decision that may never come. In what could have been just another chapter in a frustrating court drama, Paul realizes the opportunity to bring the story of Jesus to the central beating heart of the Gentile world, the capital city of Rome itself. He demands that he be transferred to Rome to be judged by Caesar. Festus, eager to be rid of this whole problem, agrees, and he sends Paul to Rome. But it takes Paul a very long time to get there. The journey to the capital city is eventful, to say the least. On the way, Paul experiences his fourth shipwreck and was very nearly killed by the Roman soldiers as the ship was going down, until the centurion decided against it. The ship ran aground on the island of Malta, where Paul would stay for several months. It's sometime during this stay that he is bit by a poisonous snake, but he miraculously survives. The Maltese leadership finds this all very impressive and eventually helps Paul and the survivors of the Roman shipwreck secure new passage to their destination. When Paul arrives in the capital city, he rents a house at his own expense, which is traditional for those who are under house arrest in Rome at this time in history, and a Roman guard is attached to him to make sure that he doesn't skip town as he awaits the emperor to make room in his very busy schedule to hear the case. During this period, Paul received visitors into that home and continued to teach and preach about the risen Jesus, and it is here that the scriptural record of Paul's life abruptly ends. From here on, we have church history, tradition, and some good old-fashioned conjecture to help guide us in assembling the relatively short remainder of the Apostle Paul's life. It's speculated that, much in keeping with the Roman attitude towards Paul's case back in Judea, Paul's 2-year stint under house arrest in Rome came to an end without a verdict, and possibly without the emperor even ever hearing his case. Though we're fairly certain that the emperor of this time, Nero, is aware of Paul. The 2 years of house arrest expired in AD 60, and tradition has always firmly held that Paul traveled to Spain sometime after the year 60, which couldn't have happened unless the Romans decided that it was no longer worth it to keep Paul under house arrest. And so Paul availed himself of this opportunity to push the gospel even further into Western Europe, toward the very edges of known civilization at that time. For Paul, it must have looked like an endless horizon of possibilities for growing the church and reconciling groups of people who truly were so far away from the God of Israel, both spiritually and both physically in terms of their physical relationship to Jerusalem from where the church was spreading. This must have been an exciting time full of promise until a great calamity befell Rome. In 64 AD, 4 years later, the Great Fire of Rome was ignited, and it was every bit the disaster that history has painted it to be. The fire burned for 6 days, with an additional 3 days of flare-ups after it had been officially extinguished. When the smoke cleared, more than 2/3 of the city had been destroyed. As usually happens when there is such a grave disaster, a political crisis began as officials and survivors searched for someone to blame. Many historians believe that Emperor Nero himself may have started the fire for his own purposes. In tribute to his venality, Nero wanted to greatly expand his palace and the palatial grounds of the emperor, but the elite patrician class in the city found Nero's desires gaudy and tasteless. The ravenous fire gave Nero the perfect excuse to rebuild and expand his property. Other historians, and of course Nero himself at the time, placed the blame on the fire on the Christian community in Rome. Nero demanded that numerous Christians be arrested and brought to the imperial capital to be tried as arsonists and murderers, including the Apostle Paul, who was brought back in chains to Rome and tried. Church tradition tells us that the Apostle Peter was also arrested and brought to Rome at the same time, and that both were executed by the Roman state very close to one another. Peter was crucified, but out of his love for Jesus and his feeling that he was unworthy to die in the same manner as his Lord, Peter requested to be crucified upside down. Paul's Roman citizenship prevented him from being crucified, so instead he was beheaded by an axe. Tradition states for us that once his head was severed from his body, it bounced 3 times upon the ground before coming to rest. And it's from this detail of Paul's death that we get the name of the church that was built on the traditional site of Paul's execution. That is the Church of the 3 Fountains, one for each bounce. Paul's body was initially placed in a tomb belonging to a wealthy Roman woman named Matrona Lucilla. But as imperial persecution of Christianity ramped up under Emperor Vespasian, who you may remember from some of our previous studies, the remains were relocated and hidden in the catacombs to prevent them from being desecrated. Eventually, after the Edict of Milan of the 4th century and the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, a basilica was built to house Paul's body, called the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. Recent explorations of that basilica and the traditional sarcophagus of Paul reveal that there are indeed inside it the remains of a man, and carbon dating techniques applied to those remains indicate that the date of this body's existence as a living person was somewhere between the 1st and 2nd centuries, which is right in the ballpark to be Paul's true remains. The inscription on the sarcophagus reads, Paulo Apostolo Mart, Paul, Apostle, Martyr. So that is the whole sketch of the Apostle Paul's life and the major events within it. God protected and preserved Paul over 30 years of dangerous, fruitful, and tumultuous ministry. And Paul used this time that God had given him to dramatic effect, crafting some of the greatest documents of the early Christian movement that have become an integral part of our New Testament scriptures. Despite constant threats, riots, arrests, lashings, shipwrecks, and famine, Paul remained faithful to God's call to open up the gospel to the Gentile nations, even if it meant that the most powerful empire among those Gentile nations would put him to death. Paul's life is a life of courage, of persistence, and of an unyielding faith that the God of Israel had raised Jesus from the dead in order to save all of humankind. Now that we studied what happened to Paul in his life, next week we'll turn our attention to his writings. We'll begin to survey each of the books that are attributed to him and attempt to plug those books into the greater narrative of Acts and of Paul's life as we now understand it. I hope you'll join us next week. Until then, the Lord bless you. Thank you for hanging in on a much longer study than usual, and we'll see you again next time.